The room went quiet the moment the guns came out. Not the kind of silence you hear at night, but the heavy kind that presses on your chest and makes every breath feel loud. Lucky Luciano's men didn't shout. They didn't rush. They simply stood, coats slightly open, hands firm on cold steel, making sure the message was clear. This was their room, their city, their rules. And sitting right in the middle of it all was one man who refused to move, Bumpy Johnson. New York in the mid-1940s was celebrating the end of World War II. Soldiers were coming home. Streets were full, music spilled out of clubs, and America was trying to feel hopeful again. But behind closed doors, in private rooms away from the crowds, another kind of war was being planned. This one had nothing to do with flags or uniforms. It was about power, money, and control. And at the center of it stood Lucky Luciano, the man who had reshaped the Mafia into a modern criminal empire. Luciano had just been released from prison after cutting a deal with the U.S. government. His freedom came with a deadline. In a matter of weeks, he would be deported back to Italy, likely forever. Before leaving, he needed to secure his legacy. The Italian Mafia was organized. The families were aligned. The docs, the unions, the politicians, all accounted for. All except one place that refused to bend. Harlem. Harlem wasn't just another neighborhood. It was its own world, running on trust, community ties, and an underground economy that printed money every single day. The numbers racket alone was pulling in millions, and it was controlled by Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy, but he was smart, patient, and deeply respected by the people who lived there. The Italians had tried before to take Harlem by force, and it ended badly for them. Luciano knew better than to repeat that mistake. That's why this meeting mattered. That's why the Store Club's VIP room was locked down that night. That's why Luciano brought his top men, enforcers, planners, and killers who survived decades in the Underworld. And that's why, when Bumpy Johnson walked in alone, without bodyguards, without fear, every man in the room watched him closely. The tension didn't explode right away. It simmered. Words were exchanged calmly. Offers were made. Lines were drawn. Luciano spoke about partnerships, protection, and percentages. He spoke like a businessman, not a gangster. But behind every word was a warning. Say yes, and you live rich. Say no, and you don't live long. Bumpy listened. He didn't rush. He didn't interrupt. He sat there calmly, cigar in hand, as if the room wasn't filled with men who had ended lives without hesitation. That calm was unsettling. It made Luciano's men nervous. And nervous men in that world didn't stay patient for long. That's when it happened. A chair scraped slightly. A coat shifted. Hands moved. Suddenly, the guns were out. Not pointed yet, but close enough to leave no doubt about what could happen next. The air felt thin. One wrong word. One wrong move. This was the moment where most men would back down. Agree to anything just to walk out alive. But Bumpy Johnson didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at the guns for long. Instead, he did something so unexpected, so calculated, that it made Lucky Luciano pause. And in a room where hesitation often meant death, that pause would change everything. What Bumpy did next didn't just save his life. It forced the most powerful mob boss in America to stand down. And it rewrote the rules of who really controlled New York. The pause felt longer than it really was. In that frozen moment, every man in the room understood exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just a business meeting anymore. This was about pride, territory, and who truly had the upper hand. Lucky Luciano had built his reputation on never letting anyone challenge him openly. And yet here he was, watching Bumpy Johnson sit calmly in front of armed men, acting as if time itself was on his side. To understand why that silence mattered, you have to understand who Bumpy Johnson really was. He didn't rise through chaos or brute force. He rose through discipline. Growing up in Harlem, Bumpy learned early that power didn't come from being the loudest man in the room. It came from knowing people, understanding their needs, and protecting your own. The numbers runners trusted him. The shop owners respected him. Even many cops looked the other way, not out of fear, but because things stayed orderly under Bumpy's watch. Lucky Luciano knew all of this. That's exactly why this meeting existed in the first place. Luciano wasn't here to intimidate for show. He was here because Harlem printed money, and money without control was a problem he couldn't afford before leaving the country. His men, though, were used to solving problems in a different way. They had grown up believing that a visible threat ended conversations quickly. Guns had always been their final argument. But Bumpy had already survived men like that. Years earlier, when Dutch Schultz tried to force his way into Harlem, the streets turned tense and unpredictable. Violence brought heat. Heat brought attention. And attention brought consequences. Schultz never understood that Harlem wasn't a place you could simply take. Bumpy understood it perfectly, and Luciano quietly did too. As Luciano studied Bumpy's face, he wasn't looking for fear. He was looking for a crack, a sign that pressure was working. He didn't find one. Bumpy's eyes stayed steady, almost thoughtful, as if he were weighing something far bigger than his own safety. That alone made Luciano uneasy. Men who had nothing to lose were dangerous. Men who knew exactly what they were risking were even worse. Around the table, tension spread. Frank Costello watched closely, already calculating outcomes. Meyer Lansky stayed quiet, listening more than speaking, sensing that this wasn't a moment for force but for leverage. Albert Anastasia shifted in his chair, clearly impatient. He was a man of action, not patience, and the longer this dragged on, the more unpredictable he became. Outside the club, Manhattan moved on like nothing was happening. Cars passed, music played, people laughed. Inside that room, the future of Harlem hung in the balance. If this deal went wrong, it wouldn't just mean a broken agreement. It would mean a slow, brutal struggle that neither side could fully control. And both Bumpy and Luciano knew it. Luciano leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch. He wanted Bumpy to speak first, to give something away. But Bumpy remained still, as if he were waiting for Luciano to realize something on his own. That realization was simple, yet dangerous. This was a meeting Luciano controlled as much as he thought. The guns were still there. The threat was still real. But the power in the room had begun to shift in a way no one expected. And as Luciano prepared to say his next words, one question lingered in every mind at the table. Was Bumpy Johnson about to walk into a trap, or had he already set one his own? Luciano finally broke the silence, but not in the way his men expected. He didn't give an order. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked a question, calm and controlled, as if the guns in the room didn't exist. It was the kind of question meant to draw a man out, to see how he thought under pressure. Bumpy heard it, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he shifted slightly in his chair, slow enough to keep everyone guessing, deliberate enough to remind them that every move he made was intentional. From Bumpy's side of the table, the situation looked different. He knew the reputation of every man in that room. He knew who followed orders and who enjoyed going too far. He also knew that once guns appeared, things could spiral fast if pride took over. That's why he stayed calm. Panic would have given Luciano exactly what he wanted: control. And Bumpy had spent his entire life making sure Harlem never lost that. Across from him, Luciano was fighting a different battle. Time was closing in. Deportation meant distance, and distance meant vulnerability. Once he was gone, others would test his authority. Any sign of weakness now would follow him overseas. That was why Harlem mattered so much. Securing it meant stability. Losing it meant unfinished business, and unfinished business was dangerous in Luciano's world. Frank Costello glanced between the two men, sensing the deeper layers beneath the standoff. This wasn't just about money. It was about legacy. Costello understood negotiations, understood compromise, but he also knew how easy things could collapse if emotion took over. He could see that Bumpy wasn't bluffing. There was confidence there, the kind that usually came from preparation, not luck. Meyer Lansky watched quietly, his mind already running numbers and scenarios. From his perspective, conflict was bad for business. Harlem's numbers racket was valuable because it was stable. If that stability broke, everyone would lose. He wondered what Bumpy had that made him sit so comfortably in a room full of powerful men. Information? Influence? Something else entirely? Whatever it was, it clearly mattered. Albert Anastasia, on the other hand, saw the situation through a simpler lens. To him, hesitation was weakness. He didn't like that Bumpy wasn't reacting the way most men did. It felt like a challenge, and challenges demanded answers. His fingers tapped against his chair, impatience building, waiting for a signal that never came. Bumpy finally spoke, but his words were measured, almost quiet. He didn't talk about threats or consequences. He talked about Harlem, about how things worked there, about how quickly chaos could spread if outsiders pushed too hard. He spoke like a man protecting a system, not just a territory. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized. Luciano listened closely. Beneath his calm expression, his mind was turning. He had seen plenty of tough men fold under pressure. Bumpy wasn't folding. That meant this meeting was no longer about forcing a deal. It was about understanding the cost of failure. And that cost, Luciano suspected, went far beyond one room or one night. The guns were still present. The tension hadn't eased. If anything, it had deepened. Every man sensed that whatever came next would set events in motion that couldn't be undone. As Luciano prepared to respond, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a test of power. It was a test of who truly understood the city they were trying to control, and who was willing to risk everything to keep it. The air in the room felt tighter now, as if every word spoken had slowly drained the oxygen. Luciano leaned forward again, elbows resting lightly on the table, eyes never leaving Bumpy's face. This wasn't intimidation anymore. It was examination. Luciano had spent his life reading people, spotting weakness, predicting reactions, and yet Bumpy Johnson wasn't giving him anything to grab onto. That alone made the situation dangerous. Bumpy could feel the attention pressing in from every side. He didn't need to look at the guns to know they were still there. He could sense Anastasia's impatience, Costello's calculation, Lansky's quiet curiosity. Each man saw him differently. To some, he was a problem. To others, an opportunity. Bumpy understood that if this meeting went the wrong way, Harlem wouldn't just face pressure, it would face instability. And instability always hurt the people who had the least protection. Luciano spoke again, this time softer, almost conversational. He talked about order, about how New York had nearly torn itself apart before the Mafia was structured, about how chaos benefited no one in the long run. His words sounded reasonable, even logical, but underneath them was a reminder. Order only existed when everyone accepted the same authority. The question hanging in the room was whether Bumpy was willing to accept that authority or challenge it. Bumpy listened without interrupting. When he finally responded, his tone stayed even. He spoke about responsibility, about how Harlem ran, because people trusted the system in place. Numbers runners showed up every day because they believed they'd be paid. Families stayed quiet because they knew violence wasn't welcome on their streets. He didn't say Luciano couldn't be part of that system. He only made it clear that forcing his way in would break it. That distinction landed harder than any threat. Luciano's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. He was starting to realize that this wasn't a simple power play. This was a man defending an ecosystem, one that couldn't survive under outside pressure. And Luciano knew that if Harlem exploded, the fallout wouldn't stop at its borders. Around the table, reactions varied. Lansky leaned back slightly, already seeing how much money could be lost if things turned ugly. Costello remained silent, sensing that this conversation was moving toward a point of no return. Anastasia, still restless, adjusted his stance, clearly struggling with the idea that restraint might be the smarter move. Outside, the city kept breathing. Somewhere, music played. Somewhere, people laughed, unaware that a single decision inside a private room could ripple across New York's underworld. That contrast made the moment feel heavier, more unreal. Luciano paused again, longer this time. He knew whatever he said next would shape the future, either through cooperation or conflict. He glanced briefly at his men, then back to Bumpy, as if weighing not just the offer on the table, but the man sitting across from him. Bumpy met his gaze without flinching. He wasn't daring Luciano to act. He was daring him to think. The tension reached its peak in that silence. Everyone felt it. The guns remained untouched, but their presence felt louder than ever. The next words spoken in that room wouldn't just decide a deal. They would decide whether New York stayed balanced or tipped into something no one could fully control. Luciano's eyes drifted away from Bumpy for the first time, moving slowly around the table as if he were checking the room itself. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight. It wasn't just about Harlem anymore. He began talking about pressure from all sides, other families watching closely, rivals waiting for a mistake, politicians growing impatient. He hinted that once he left the country, promises could weaken, loyalties could shift. Order,
you think you can cross us? I ain't scared of you or your goons.
People got hurt who never signed up for the game. That was
Put the
when
gun
Bumpy
down and
realized
talk.
a
Talk
real
is cheap.
message
Show me the
hidden
money.
underneath the words. This wasn't only a negotiation. It was a warning. Luciano wasn't just asking for cooperation. He was asking for insurance. If Harlem stayed independent, it could become a symbol, and symbols were dangerous. Other neighborhoods might start thinking they could do the same. The balance of power in New York depended on no one stepping too far outside the lines. Before Bumpy could respond, one of Luciano's men moved closer to the table, not aggressively, but enough to shift the mood again. It was subtle, but everyone noticed. The guns weren't raised, but the implication was clear. The window for calm discussion was narrowing. Time was being applied as pressure. Bumpy leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. Inside, his mind was moving fast. He thought about Harlem's runners, the families, the quiet deals that kept streets calm. He thought about how quickly rumors traveled, how fear could spread if word got out that the Italians were pushing again. And then he thought about something else, something Luciano didn't know he knew. Luciano paused mid-sentence when he noticed a change in Bumpy's posture. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defiance. It was confidence, sharpened by certainty. That unsettled him more than anger ever could. Men only sat like that when they were holding something back. Bumpy finally spoke, his voice steady but firmer now. He mentioned a few recent events around the city.
Easy now.
Raids that never made the papers,
no more talk.
investigations
Where's the
installed
money?
without explanation, deals that quietly disappeared. At first, it sounded like casual observation. But as he spoke, the connections became clearer. Someone had been feeding information. Someone had been influencing outcomes behind the scenes. Lansky's attention sharpened immediately. Costello straightened in his chair. Even Anastasia stopped shifting. Luciano listened without interruption, his face carefully controlled, but his jaw tightened just slightly. Bumpy wasn't accusing anyone directly. He didn't need to. He was painting a picture of a city where information moved faster than muscle, where quiet leverage mattered more than loud threats. He made it clear that Harlem wasn't isolated. It was informed. It paid attention. And it reacted when pushed. The room felt smaller now. What started as a power play had turned into a chessboard. Luciano began to understand that forcing this deal could trigger consequences he couldn't predict, especially with his departure so close. Any instability now could follow him overseas, weakening the structure he had worked decades to build. Then came the real twist. Bumpy hinted that this meeting itself wasn't as private as everyone believed. Not that anyone was listening in, but that its outcome would travel fast. Word would spread through the streets, through back channels, through people who mattered. How Luciano handled Harlem tonight would define how others saw his strength, or his limits. That landed hard. Luciano had always understood perception. Fear only worked when it was believed. Respect only lasted when it was reinforced. If this meeting ended badly, it wouldn't just mean trouble with Bumpy Johnson. It could invite challenges from places he couldn't reach anymore. The tension spiked again, sharper than before. This wasn't about percentages or partnerships anymore. This was about who would blink first, and what that blink would cost them. Luciano looked at Bumpy, searching his face one more time. Bumpy met his gaze calmly, as if he had already accepted whatever came next. The guns were still present. The silence was heavier than ever. And somewhere in that quiet, the future of Harlem and Luciano's legacy hung on the edge of decision that hadn't been spoken yet. Luciano finally exhaled, slow and deliberate, as if he had been holding his breath for the entire night. When he spoke, the room leaned in without realizing it. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness now that hadn't been there before. He said he understood Harlem better than most people thought. He admitted that brute force had failed there before and would fail again. Then he did something none of his men expected. He told the bodyguards to step back. The shift was immediate. Not relief, not comfort, but shock. The guns disappeared beneath coats, though the tension didn't vanish with them. Luciano's eyes stayed on Bumpy the entire time. This wasn't surrender. It was acknowledgement. Luciano wasn't backing down because he was weak. He was backing down because he recognized a stalemate that favored no one. Luciano spoke about legacy, about how power meant nothing if it collapsed the moment you turned your back. He said he didn't want a war in Harlem, not now, not ever. He admitted that he had underestimated how deeply rooted Bumpy's influence really was. Harlem wasn't just territory, it was loyalty. And loyalty couldn't be bought or forced overnight. Bumpy listened, still calm, but now he leaned forward slightly. He didn't celebrate, he didn't smile. He spoke about boundaries, about how partnerships only worked when both sides respected limits. He made it clear that Harlem would remain self-run, self-protected, and free from outside muscle. Any cooperation would be clean, quiet, and structured. Nothing flashy, nothing that brought heat. Luciano nodded slowly. He adjusted his position at the table, no longer looming, no longer testing. He asked one final question, direct and honest. If we do this your way, what guarantees do I have? Bumpy didn't answer right away. He reached into his briefcase, calm enough to make a few men shift in their seats again. He placed something on the table, sliding it just far enough for Luciano to see. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it changed everything. Luciano studied it carefully. His expression didn't crack, but the meaning was clear. This wasn't just leverage. It was assurance. Proof that Bumpy understood how the city really worked, and proof that he had no interest in burning it down, only in protecting what was his. Luciano looked up and nodded once. That was it. The main conflict, the question of whether Harlem would be taken by force or destroyed by pride, was settled in that small motion. The deal would move forward on Bumpy's terms. No soldiers in Harlem. No public pressure. Business handled quietly, through channels that kept the streets calm and the money moving. Around the table, reactions softened. Costello finally relaxed his shoulders. Lansky allowed himself a small, thoughtful smile, already seeing the long-term stability in the arrangement. Even Anastasia, though clearly unhappy, understood that pushing further would only create problems no one could clean up. Luciano stood, signaling the end of the meeting. He extended his hand to Bumpy, not as a show, but as a sign of mutual recognition. When Bumpy stood and shook it, the grip was firm, equal. Two men from different worlds, meeting at the same level. As they released hands, Luciano said something quietly, almost himself. He admitted that most men mistook silence for weakness. He said Bumpy had proven otherwise. That respect, when earned, lasted longer than fear ever could. Bumpy responded just as quietly. He said Harlem didn't bow easily, but it remembered who treated it fairly. The men filed out slowly, one by one. The room emptied, but the weight of what had just happened lingered. On the surface, it looked like a simple agreement, business as usual, but beneath it was a shift that would ripple through New York's underworld for years. And then came the final twist. As Bumpy gathered his briefcase and prepared to leave, Luciano watched him closely and asked one last question. He asked how long Bumpy had known the Italians were planning this move. Bumpy paused at the door, turned slightly, and answered without looking back. Long enough to make sure you didn't walk in blind. Luciano smiled, a mix of admiration and realization settling in. The truth hit him then. This meeting hadn't been a reaction. It had been anticipated, planned, controlled. Bumpy hadn't just stood his ground. He had shaped the entire moment before Luciano ever stepped into the room. As the door closed behind Bumpy Johnson, Luciano remained standing, silent. The conflict was resolved. The deal was made. But the real surprise was clear now. Harlem hadn't survived the mob by luck. It survived because the man running it was always 3 steps ahead. The door closed softly behind Bumpy Johnson, and for a moment, no one in the room spoke. Lucky Luciano stayed where he was, hands resting on the table, staring at the spot where Bumpy had been sitting just seconds earlier. It wasn't anger on his face. It wasn't frustration either. It was something rarer in his world. Respect mixed with caution. He knew he had just dealt with a man who didn't need threats to protect his ground. The meeting ended without raised voices, without chaos, without bloodshed. To the outside world, nothing unusual had happened that night at the Stork Club. Music continued downstairs. Drinks were poured. Laughter filled the air. But behind that closed door, the balance of power in New York had quietly shifted. Harlem had not been taken. It had been acknowledged. In the days that followed, word traveled the way it always did in the Underworld. Quietly, carefully, through trusted mouths. People didn't talk about guns or confrontations. They talked about how Lucky Luciano had chosen negotiation over force. They talked about how Bumpy Johnson had walked into a room full of powerful men alone and walked out on his own terms. That story mattered more than any threat ever could. Luciano left the country weeks later, just as planned, from Italy. He continued to influence decisions, but Harlem was never treated like an open target again. The numbers racket kept running smoothly. Money moved through clean channels. Problems were handled quietly. There were no Italian soldiers patrolling Harlem streets. No public shows of dominance. The agreement held because both sides understood what was at stake if it didn't. For Bumpy, life went on much the same as before, at least on the surface. He stayed visible but not flashy. He kept his routines, met with his people, listened more than he spoke. Harlem remained stable, which was exactly how he wanted it. Stability meant trust, and trust meant survival. He knew the deal wasn't just about percentages or protection. It was about preserving a way of life that outsiders never fully understood. There were still challenges. There always were. Pressure from law enforcement came and went. Rivals tested boundaries now and then. But the difference was clear. Harlem wasn't isolated. It wasn't vulnerable. It was connected in a way that made people think twice before pushing too hard. That single meeting had created a quiet understanding that lasted for years. Even among the Italian families, the story carried weight. Younger men heard it as a lesson. Power didn't always come from force. Sometimes it came from knowing when not to use it. Older men understood something deeper. Luciano hadn't lost that night. He had preserved his empire by avoiding a fight he couldn't truly win. That decision protected his legacy long after he left American soil. Bumpy never spoke publicly about the meeting. He didn't need to. His influence spoke for him. Those close to him knew that preparation had made all the difference. He hadn't walked into that room hoping for the best. He had walked in knowing the risks, knowing the players, and knowing exactly how far he could push without breaking everything. That awareness was his real strength. Years later, when Bumpy faced his own setbacks, the respect he had earned didn't disappear. People remembered how he handled pressure. They remembered that he valued order over chaos. When he returned to Harlem after time away, the streets were still standing. The system still worked. That alone said more than any reputation ever could. Looking back, that night at the Stork Club became more than a story about organized crime. It became a lesson about leadership, about how real control isn't loud or reckless. It's steady, it's patient, it's built on understanding people rather than intimidating them. Bumpy Johnson didn't defeat Lucky Luciano. He outthought him, and in doing so, he protected Harlem without turning it into a battlefield. The true takeaway from that night wasn't about who had more power. It was about how power was used. One man came with an empire behind him. The other came with preparation, leverage, and a deep connection to his community. When those two forces met, the outcome proved something lasting. Respect can stop a gun faster than fear ever will. That meeting didn't just secure a deal, it set a standard. And decades later, it's remembered not because of violence, but because two men chose intelligence over destruction, and one of them walked away having changed rules without firing a single shot.